And we are live here, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. What is good, guys? Nick Script, P2W Fantasy Podcast, heading into week 10, second live stream of the week. Super excited about this show. It's been a great week just in general. As always, this podcast is partnered up with the Fantasy Points Media Group, which is a branch of fantasypoints.com. Go check out fantasypoints.com. It's a one-stop shop for everything fantasy football you are looking for. I'm on that site every single day. Use my discount code P2W22 for a discount. Heading into week 10, we're going to talk streams and starts that I do like in the matchups for this coming weekend. Stick with me as we get into the show.
Play to win, no fear to give. I feel but I can't forgive. I go all in this time, yeah, I won't regret. I'll pick the best on trip, they don't understand. I play to win, yeah, I play to win, I play to win. Yeah, I play to win, I play to win. Oh, play to win, I play to win. Yeah, play to win, I play to win.
So the purpose of this show every single week is to talk about start streams that I like to beat their projections and be beneficial to your fantasy football lineup. So I don't talk about the most obvious of picks. Last week I had some deeper league picks that actually did pretty good. But as always, accountability. Let's just run through the week 9 starts and sits. I had some streams as well. So Justin Fields, excellent. Trevor Lawrence, not so great. Didn't completely bust. Geno Smith, solid. Raheem Mostert and Deonta Foreman, not so good. Jamal Williams, right around his projection. So that's a wash. Joshua Palmer, good. Tyler Boyd, not good. Chris Olave, not good. Wasn't terrible, though. Dubs got injured. Christian Kirk, good. Juju, good. Demarcus Robinson, I don't even know what he's projected, but he was bad. Terrace Marshall was good. Gerald Everett, Tyler Conklin, not so much. Isaiah Likely, right around his projections. And then for the streams, Goff and Mariota were not good, but Cade Otton and Juwan Johnson were good. So some hits, some misses, but always got to talk about, what went well, what didn't go well. But we'll head into the starts here for week 10 after I go through some streams. So I dropped a video earlier. If you missed it, it was on TikTok, it was on Facebook, it was on Twitter, but it was players to consider streaming that are currently rostered in under 50% of ESPN redraft leagues. So the roster percentages could have changed from now or from back then until now throughout the hours of the day. So maybe guys went above 50%. But here's a couple guys that I mentioned in that video that if you are really looking for a streaming option, to consider these guys. So number one, I wrote down, or I spoke about, Jimmy Garoppolo versus the Chargers. So Debo just logged a full practice Thursday. Christian McCaffrey, George Kittle, Brandon Ayuk. He has some nice playmaking pieces around his bubble there. In 7 appearances, he scored 16-plus fantasy points in 5 of them. So maybe he doesn't have the upside to win you your matchup, but I feel like he's a reliable spot start typically week to week. So versus the Chargers, if you're looking for a quarterback, I feel like if you're looking for a guy to get you 16 to 18, Jimmy Garoppolo is your guy. Next for the streamers, again, these are guys rostered in under 50% of ESPN leagues, but if you're looking for a spot start, Jacoby Brissett versus the Dolphins. So big revenge game that everybody is talking about. But in all seriousness, he's coming off of a season-high 20.32 fantasy points in week 8 before the bye. He's not had a ton of big fantasy weeks, but he's thrown for 250 or more passing yards in his last 3 consecutive games. Miami is a top 10 offense in points scored per game. But on the flip side, defensively, they give up the 10th most passing yards per game and are the best fantasy matchup in terms of points per game given up to quarterbacks, which could create a decent game script for Jacoby Brissett in this one. Some more streams, Greg Dulcich for the tight end position versus Tennessee. I'm surprised he was not rostered in over 50% of ESPN leagues when I checked this morning, especially seeing, the games that he's had. But he is coming off of a bye, so the bye week can do that to you when guys are obviously not picking him up when he can't play him. But across his only 3 NFL games, week 6 through 8, he has been the overall tight end 3 during that span. He's averaged 12.1 fantasy points. He scored week 6, 14 targets across the last 2 games played, receiving yard upside glimpse in week 8 with 87. And the Titans give up they're a top 10 matchup in points per game given up to tight ends. So good matchup. We've seen him score already. We've seen the targets coming in. He had some receiving yard upside. Greg Dulcich is a good guy to stream this week. Same with Cade Otton versus Seattle. So Cameron Brate might be back after missing 4 out of 5 of their last games, but we have to note all the positives on Otton. Weeks 5 through 8, he's seen 7, 3, 5, 5, and 6 targets, so some pretty good consistency in what he's getting from Tom Brady. 2 out of 3 of his last games played, he's netted over 60 receiving yards. He scored a touchdown last week and had a season-high 17.8 fantasy points. So Cade Otton versus Seattle. Cole Kmet will be the other one I want to mention here versus Detroit. Detroit is a plus matchup across the board for quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. 3 touchdowns in his last 2 games after not scoring at all in 2021 is a good sign. It's what we missed all of last season from him. Great signs from this past game, though, include a season high of 6 targets, his 3rd game of 40-plus receiving yards. He scored 2 touchdowns in that game, and Chicago was pretty creative with his role. They had him carry the ball twice. He had a season-high 22 fantasy points. So Cole Kmet versus Detroit. 3 quick options if you're looking for a defense and special teams. The Giants are playing the Houston offense, who are scoring the 5th least points per game this season. Arizona might be facing a John Wolford-led offense. I think Matt Stafford practiced today, so I would say Arizona would be a stream if Stafford is out of the game. And then the last one, the Raiders, they're facing the Colts offense, who their last 3 games have scored 10, 16, and 3 points total. And they're facing Sam Ehlinger, who has not looked that great. So let's shift over to our actual starts here. I got to take it to the hizzy in the comments saying it's Fields season, which is such a great pivot to what we are about to be talking about here. So Justin Fields, I do want to mention versus Detroit. Once his play turned the corner in week 5, from there through week 9, Fields has been the QB1 overall in fantasy, averaging 25.91 fantasy points. He went wild last week for 42.72 fantasy points. He broke Michael Vick's regular season single game rushing record with 178 rushing yards. Season high 28 passing attempts. Season high 3 passing touchdowns. He added 1 on the ground. So now we're seeing some glimpse of him doing some good things through the air, not just with his legs, which is what he's been doing the last few games. I'm just reminding you of how hot he's been because, number one, the Detroit Lions are giving up a high amount of fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. Number 2, for me, outside of Patrick Mahomes and Jalen Hurts, I'm really not sure with Josh Allen potentially being out, who else I would start over Justin Fields this week in a great matchup, who is on fire right now against the Lions. Next quarterback I'll mention, Russell Wilson versus Tennessee. I've had this bitterness with Russell Wilson because this is a personal story, but I had one time a former, coworker at a soccer club I worked for, coach, asked me, should they start Russell Wilson, or I forgot who it was. I think it might have been like Kirk Cousins on a given week. And I said, Russ. It was the only time she ever asked me for fantasy advice. He then went on to score under 10 fantasy points, and I felt like a complete fraud. She's probably like, this guy is talking on streams, has no idea what he's talking about. Maybe I don't. But that's my bitterness to Russell Wilson. But he does draw a nice fantasy matchup in Week 10 versus Tennessee, giving up the 5th most points per game to quarterbacks in fantasy, and they give up the 3rd most passing yards per game. Wilson only has 1 day above 20 fantasy points, and he's been pretty below average this season. So there is some risk to this, but I feel like if there is a week to show signs of Seattle Seahawk Russell Wilson, this would be the week against the Tennessee Titans. Last quarterback I want to mention, another guy that's had, ups and downs this season, hasn't been phenomenal, but Tom Brady versus Seattle. Keep in mind in this game that it is the Sunday morning game being played in Germany, which is super cool. But overall, Tom Brady has not completely busted this fantasy season. He ranks QB 13 overall right now in total points. He's averaging 15.38. He only has 1 game with multiple touchdown passes thrown. He has no upside with his legs, which is something we know. He's thrown under 65% for his completion percentage 4 times now. So there's a lot of asterisks next to him for this fantasy season. He's been well below expectations. I don't think any of us expected him to be, a top 5 quarterback again, but definitely hasn't been somebody that's really helped your lineup. But here's some positives to mention. He's not turning over the ball through the air right now. 9 weeks of football, 1 interception. That's solid. So he's protecting the ball at least through the air. The Bucs are finally looking healthy too. They look like they have their full receiving core for the first time, and it's week 10. This can lead to a bump in the touchdown department, which we do want to see. We want to see him having those games of multiple passing touchdowns. The Seahawks are surprisingly competitive this year at 6-3. They're number 1 in the NFC West. On the flip side, they are a top 12 defense in both points per game given up to quarterbacks for fantasy and passing yards per game given up. This creates a pretty good game script, right? We have an offense doing pretty decent this year so far. They're winning games, but also a defense that's kind of friendly to quarterbacks. The Bucs have a lot to play for. Not ideal start for the season at 4-5. They were tied with Atlanta before Thursday's loss to Carolina. So this week gives the Bucs a chance to take a 1-game lead on the Falcons in the NFC South. This could be a turning point week for both Tom Brady and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Shifting over to the running backs. So I took all these notes on Jamal Williams, and I'll still talk about him. But then, DeAndre Swift being one of my favorite players in the league, these reports come out saying that he was pissed off last game that they held back his role, that he only had 10 snaps or something along those lines. And now, I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, here we go. I'm creating this like ESPN, narrative in my head that DeAndre Swift got hurt last year. I remember watching that game live. Roquan Smith drove him, almost spilled the pop there. Almost he pile drive him out of bounds, and it injured his shoulder, which was a play that most running backs not named Derrick Henry would probably get injured on. But now he's pissed off for not playing a lot versus Green Bay. He's voicing it. I think somebody in the organization said, take it out on the field. Now it's like this weird revenge game narrative. I got hurt in this game versus Chicago last year. I want to go, drop a bomb on them. So I'm thinking, if you got Swift, I know it wasn't ideal last week, but with him voicing these things and maybe there's some sort of like chip on his shoulder from being injured last year, I feel like you play him. On the flip side, though, I still think you play Jamal Williams, and I feel like, just seeing what Chicago's given up, it's just a great matchup for running backs. I call this out weekly, it seems like. Last week, Raheem Mostert and Jeff Wilson both scored a touchdown. Mostert on the ground, Jeff Wilson through the air. Maybe that's what's going to happen with the Lions. One on the ground with Jamal Williams, one through the air with DeAndre Swift. Tony Pollard ran for 131 rushing yards and 3 touchdowns on them. Ramondre scored a touchdown, had 8 catches. Brian Robinson scored, and he combined with Gibson for 95 rushing yards. Dalvin Cook, 94 yards and 2 touchdowns. 146 rushing yards for Saquon. 80 rushing yards and a touchdown for Pierce. 6th in fantasy points per game given up to running backs, but it feels like it's worse than that. Chicago gives up the most rushing yards per game, and they lost Roquan Smith recently. So it's a great matchup. Swift's been limited. Jamal Williams did not have a super efficient day last week, but saw 24 rushing attempts, which is the volume you want out of your fantasy running back. He's also had 4 games of 2 rushing touchdowns, which is due to the red zone work he receives. He's 5th in total red zone touches. So Jamal Williams, I'm sure all of us are seeing these reports about Swift. I feel like if you have him, it's a plus matchup. He's a good play again this week. And I'll go to that same game with David Montgomery versus Detroit. There's a lot of hesitation to put David Montgomery in lineups. Many will reference Chicago having a committee. There are some who will flat out say Khalil Herbert is better than David Montgomery. Last week, Montgomery was on the field for 70% of the snaps for his 2nd consecutive week after he saw a huge dip in week 7 of snap percentages. 15 total touches to Khalil Herbert's 7, who only saw 28% of the snaps. It was a tight game versus Miami. It didn't look like a committee last week. It feels like forever ago that Monty had a big week, one worth actually mentioning. 18.2 in week 5 versus Minnesota, 15.6 week 2 versus Green Bay. Let's stay in the NFC North and say he's going to have another solid day versus the Lions. Get the trifecta. 122 rushing yards versus Green Bay. I'm calling in this game, Montgomery goes for 100 yards, even with Justin Fields using his legs against a Lions defense who gives up the 8th most points per game to fantasy running backs and 9th most rushing yards per game allowed. I'm done mentioning Chicago Bears players for the rest of this podcast, I promise. But it's refreshing that as a Bears fan and a fantasy analyst that we can actually talk about Chicago Bears players because we haven't been able to for the first like four or 5 weeks of football. So it is refreshing. Next, I want to mention Jeff Wilson versus Cleveland. So Miami sent the 2023 fifth round pick to San Francisco for Jeff Wilson, which reunited Jeff Wilson not only with head coach Mike McDaniels, who was the former San Francisco offensive coordinator, but also Raheem Mostert. They were former teammates. After seeing over 60% of the snaps all of weeks 4 through 8, Mostert saw just 47% of the snaps in week 9. 9 total touches. He did score a rushing touchdown. Jeff Wilson, on the other hand, had a slight edge in snap percentage with 49%, but had 12 total touches. He also scored, but through the air. He had 3 receptions. So the 2 split carries evenly, but Jeff Wilson was more efficient with his touches. So I think this game versus Chicago last week had a couple signs here. Number 1, both guys are going to get some sort of work, right? Number 2, though, there was no hesitation to give Jeff Wilson plenty of work his first ever game as a Dolphin. And it was not a blowout. It wasn't a game that they can, try things out. It was a very tight game versus Chicago. I also see that Wilson is the receiving back between the two. I feel like I get that sense just off a 1-game sample size. And I'm going to take the guy that gets the work through the air, the guy that came in his first game, had more snaps, had a higher snap percentage, I'll say, and more total touches. The Browns give up the 3rd most fantasy points per game to running backs on the year. So the matchup is good. Jeff Wilson, I'm going to lean for him having the better day here versus the Browns. Next, Darrell Henderson versus Arizona. And some news came out that Kyren Williams is back, the rookie. And a lot of people are pretty excited about him. And it makes the running back room even more murky. If we look at week 9, Henderson played 49% of the snaps, had 12 touches. Malcolm Brown played 28% of the snaps and had 3 touches. Cam Akers had 19% of the snaps and had 5 touches. None of those guys scored 6 fantasy points, though. So we've seen with the Rams roles shift throughout the season. I mean, we just saw Ronnie Rivers leading the way, I believe, in week 8. 3 games above 10 fantasy points for Henderson. I still think he leads the running back room in snap percentage and touches in week 10. He had 7 games of 15-plus fantasy points last season where he was the lead back for most of the season. I'm still a believer. Again, he's just the best guy in the room, and he's going to have some decent touches versus the Cardinals. Now we have a dilemma, though, with the potential of Stafford not playing. So we got to pay attention to that news. But in a world where Stafford doesn't play, I could see them emphasizing the run game and maybe emphasizing even more some more dump offs. And if it's going to be dumped off, I know Kyren Williams, some people will say, has that skill set, but I still think it's going to be Hendo as the priority. So Arizona is a top 12 matchup in points per game given up to running backs this year. Could make Henderson a risky play, but worth taking the shot on if you do need a running back play for week 10. Got a question in the chat. Daniel Duong, pick 1.5 PPR. Kadarius Toney versus Jacksonville. Mac Hollins versus Indianapolis. Wan'Dale Robinson versus Houston. Gallup versus Green Bay. DeAndre versus San Francisco. It's an interesting one. It's a lot of guys that have a lot of question marks. Toney, what's his role in his second ever game? Mac Hollins, he could have a bump in his role with Hunter Renfrow and Darren Waller both on IR. Wan'Dale Robinson and the Giants didn't have a great game last time they took the field, but it was the whole offense, not just Wan'Dale. Michael Gallup versus Green Bay is interesting because I feel like he's getting closer to health. DeAndre versus San Francisco. I'm not sure who that one is. I'm gonna say if I had to pick a guy that will lead this group in receptions, I think Wan'Dale Robinson has the chance. If I wanted to take a guy that I think could score a touchdown in this game, I think it's Michael Gallup. The guy who could have the most upside could be Kadarius Toney if his role takes a big jump. So out of all that, I'd say shooting high, maybe Gallup, and maybe a safer play, Wan'Dale Robinson. But back to the Week 10 starts for the wide receiver position. If you guys are seeing this live, ask questions. I'll answer them on the live stream. You have to do it on YouTube though. Chris Godwin, I want to mention versus Seattle. So tougher matchup for wide receivers when it comes to points per game given up to wide receivers. But I feel like Godwin not scoring much for fantasy lately. I feel like some people are kind of questioning if they should even put him in lineups right now. He's only averaging 11.8 fantasy points per game on the year. This is a guy who I personally did not expect to even be back until halfway through the season, let alone play week 1 after having that ACL tear in the recovery. It was a fast recovery for him. The more the season goes on, though, the further he is away from that injury, which is always a good sign. The big thing to note about Godwin is the consistent volume coming in. 4 straight weeks of 10-plus targets, with only one of those games being 10 targets. Another noteworthy mention is he has yet to score a touchdown this season. So these games floating around like 11, 12 fantasy points would be much different if he scored in those specific games. So with the volume coming in, the production should follow. The touchdowns will come. Need to look deeper sometimes than just straight up fantasy points. I have faith in Chris Godwin rest of season, especially seeing how much he's getting looked at by Tom Brady. And I also have faith in him this week. This could be the week that he finally scores that touchdown. Next mention, Jerry Jeudy versus the Tennessee Titans. So I feel like since not enough people are actually talking about Jerry Jeudy trending up the last 2 games, I'll make sure that I do as an OG truther. I feel like he's been shit on, in preseason a ton by a lot of people that I would see on Twitter. But when he does well, not enough people give him credit. So I will. This offseason and early on, it's always been like Jerry Jeudy versus Cortland Sutton. It's a big debate. Got to pick a side. But I'm just going to talk about Jerry Jeudy. I don't think I need to weigh 2 guys up. It doesn't make a ton of sense to me, especially if you roster Jerry Jeudy. So he's had a solid 2 games in a row now. 18 total targets across the last 2 weeks, 96 and 63 receiving yards in those 2 games. Good. Scored a touchdown in week 8 before the bye. 16.6 and 18.3 fantasy points in his last 2 outings. That's good. That's good. That should be in your lineups. I said this with Juju last week when I called him as a start. People forget about trends and players having good streaks of performances when a bye week hits. They come back and all is forgotten. Jeudy is trending the way that we want in the fantasy world. Now he faces the Tennessee Titans, who are giving up the 3rd most points per game to wide receivers on the year. It's a great matchup. Start Jerry Jeudy. Got 2 rookies I want to cover here. George Pickens versus the New Orleans Saints. Chase Claypool played his first game in Chicago last week. He was 2nd in targets for the Steelers prior to his departure. I've had some conversations with people who, we talked about the Steelers, who gets a bump. And some of the conversations I've had led to somebody saying, well, Deontay Johnson gets a big bump. But he's already been consistently targeted all year in this offense. He's got 76 total. That's number 6 for the wide receiver position. I think the bumps to these targets from Chase Claypool being gone go to George Pickens and Pat Freiermuth. Coming off of a bye in week 9, we have yet to actually see what happens in a Steelers offense without Claypool. Not that he was like lighting the world on fire, but he was getting targets. What I like about Pickens is the constant potential for a big play to happen, which can mean a big fantasy week. Nearly top 20 for wide receivers in air yards. His 14 deep targets ranks him number 8 overall for wide receivers. He's getting these opportunities to have big receiving days. Now he gets a potential bump in the amount of targets coming his way. Week 4, he had 102 receiving yards and 16.2 fantasy points. Week 5, he had 83 receiving yards and 14.3. Week 7, he had 61 receiving yards and 18.1 fantasy points, scored his first NFL touchdown. He has receiving yard upside in these specific games that he did well. He saw 8, 8, and 6 targets. So he was being targeted at a pretty consistent rate. Now we might be able to, have that be a weekly thing for George Pickens. I'm ready to see an 8 to 10 target day and a big play or two versus the Saints this week. Start George Pickens. Next rookie I want to mention, Chris Olave versus the Steelers. It's the same game, same matchup. But I have to give Chris Olave some love here. He's tied for wide receiver 15 overall. He's averaged 14.6 fantasy points per game. A lot of us liked Chris Olave coming in as a prospect, but this has been well beyond any person that projected and did rankings before the season for him to be a top 15 option. There might be some hesitation, though, with starting Chris Olave in lineups because he scored 10.2 and 13.1 fantasy points the last 2 weeks. Nothing's really giving you an edge. So maybe some people are like, you know what? I'm debating putting him in my lineup because he's not doing much. He has had 16 targets across these last 2 games, though. This is coming off of a season high. That was coming off of a season high 14 target week in week 7. He had 2 games prior to that with 13 targets, weeks 2 and 3. So he's had a couple games this season where he's being hyper targeted in this offense. We might see Jarvis Landry this week, but I don't think that necessarily is a bad thing for Chris Olave. I think it's probably good to have another guy out there that actually can draw some attention. A top 10 wide receiver in targets and receiving yards. The upsides I just spoke about when it came to George Pickens, the air yards and the deep targets, is even greater with Chris Olave. He's number 2 in air yards and number 1 in deep targets with 19 for wide receivers. Talk about consistent potential for splash plays and fantasy upside, Chris Olave. So math here. Top 15 wide receiver for fantasy right now. Fantasy upside potential plus high target volume plus a matchup against the number 1 defense in fantasy points per game given up to wide receivers. A smash play for week 10 is Chris Olave. Donovan Peoples-Jones. If you did not check out the redraft trades target episode, please do. It's 25 minutes. I had several analysts weigh in on a target that they think you should trade for. It's well worth your time. 25 minutes, well worth your time. Episode 162 on this podcast, if you want to check that out. Donovan Peoples-Jones was one of the targets my buddy Dave Kluge mentioned, and he's consistently been a guy I've mentioned through content who is under-rostered right now. 5 weeks of 11 and 12-ish fantasy points. I've been saying for weeks now that he is 1 touchdown away from everybody talking about him. So imagine him having a 12-point fantasy week, add the 6 for a touchdown plus, and everybody's talking about him. At least 70 receiving yards in 4 out of 5 of his last games played. During this span of weeks 4 through 8, only 10 wide receivers in the league have totaled more receiving yards. Yet this guy at the beginning of this week was on waivers in a lot of leagues. Operating as the wide receiver 2 in Cleveland, receiving yard upside. He's also going to get Deshaun Watson in the near future. If I'm mentioning Jacoby Brissett this week, I'll stack him in this episode with the less obvious pairing. Obviously, Amari Cooper would be the obvious pairing. I'll go with the wide receiver 2 in Cleveland here. The Dolphins are a top 10 matchup in fantasy points per game given up to the wide receiver position. And my bold prediction is that Donovan Peoples-Jones finally scores that touchdown this season, and more people will talk about him. 2 more wide receivers to mention. Juju Smith-Schuster versus Jacksonville. So I hit on Juju last week, and I'm looking to just keep talking about him because I've mentioned specifically with him in the past that he's trending in the right way. He's hot. So stay on guys that are trending in the right way and hot when it comes to your lineups. 113, 124, and 88 receiving yards in his last 3 outings. 2 touchdowns in his last 3 games. 22.3, 25.4, 18.8 fantasy points scored across his last 3 games. He's been great. Coming off of a season-high 12 targets, he caught 10 of them. The passing volume was extremely high with Patrick Mahomes that game. I don't have it in front of me, but I'm pretty sure he threw like 68 times. The Jaguars give up the 11th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Keep Juju in your lineup. Last wide receiver mentioned, Joshua Palmer versus San Francisco. So Keenan Allen did not practice Thursday. I feel like, I'd have to look back on the news, but I feel like he's pretty iffy to playing in this game yet again. Mike Williams is still out of the mix. Josh Palmer continues to be a strong flex play. He produced for fantasy in a small window of games last season when given the majority of the snaps as a rookie. This season, he's had 4 weeks above 13 fantasy points, which is a flex option. 22 targets in his last 2 games played shows a Justin Herbert connection with the young wide receiver. Season high 106 receiving yards last time he played versus Atlanta. The 49ers are not as friendly in giving to wide receivers in terms of fantasy. And Atlanta is a much different matchup, but seeing the target volume, the receiving yard upside, the touchdown potential he's shown in the past, Palmer's got to stay in lineups. He's got to stay as a flex play. So my big thing is, if you have him, why would you even roster him if Keenan Allen potentially and Mike Williams are not playing? Why would you not place him in your lineups? Because that's the ideal situation. Missing pieces in LA. If you have them, you either play him or you trade him. So if I have him, I'm playing him this week. We talked about some streaming tight ends. We'll talk about some starts here. All right, we got Keg Carr. Have Mahomes is a question in the chat. Have Mahomes, Saquon, Etienne, Jefferson, Pittman, Kenneth Walker, bench, Mike Will, Hurt, Lockett, J-Rob. I'm 5-4. 1 game back from playoffs. I got offered Mahomes, K. Walker, Etienne for Herbert, CMC, Waddle, Amari. Do I do it? So he's being offered Herbert, McCaffrey, Waddle, and Amari for Mahomes, Walker, Etienne. So my thing is, for situations like this, and I don't want to make it a cop-out, but I talk about trades often. I feel like we overcomplicate trades all the time. I don't see a big need in fantasy to ever send like 5 for 5, 4 for 4, 5 for 4, 6 for 5. We overcomplicate some of these trades and make these massive deals. If you are this manager and you're still listening right now, I would identify what from that side do you actually really need? What do you really want? So you're being offered Justin Herbert, you don't need him, right? Christian McCaffrey, maybe you really like him, but you do have Ken Walker, who's been great, and Travis Etienne, who's been great. Waddle and Amari Cooper, two solid wide receivers. What do you want out of that? So I would identify what you want. If it's McCaffrey, focus on McCaffrey. If it's Waddle or Amari Cooper, focus on one of those two. If it's McCaffrey and one of those wide receivers, just focus on that. Whenever we send like 5-6 pieces for 5-6 pieces, it gets too big brained. We don't need to do that in fantasy. So identify in this situation what you are really targeting. Number 1. Number 2, does it make you better? And then number 3, how do you identify their needs to go and grab that piece to make your team better? So try not to be a cop-out answer, but it's just too massive of a trade. Simplify the trade. So starting tight ends for the week that I like. I've been talking about a lot of trends lately, and I post these target trends on Twitter, these graphs all the time. I talk about trending players in fantasy because it's important. You want to follow guys that are starting to have a bigger role, guys that are starting to be healthier, guys that are starting to perform better in the fantasy world. So Dalton Schultz doesn't have the easiest of matchups. It's actually a tough matchup for tight ends versus Green Bay. But I want to talk about him because he's trending in the right direction. He's trending back to health. He's trending back to his usage. He's trending back to expectations. I actually picked up Schultz in a keeper league off of waivers. We don't have deep benches, but he was on waivers because he's been frustrating. It's been a rocky ride. Weeks 2 through 6, he either didn't play or he did play and scored under a fantasy point. He's been dealing with his nagging knee injury through the season, but there's positive signs he's getting healthier and back to himself. Across the last 2 games played, 65% and then 71% of the snaps after missing week 6. He went from 5 to 7 targets his last 2 games. He went from 49 to 74 receiving yards across his last 2 games. He had a season-high 13.9 fantasy points in his last week. So most managers who have him likely had to like pivot at some point to playing somebody else. But I feel like we're getting more comfortable with him being back into lineups. Last season, he had over 100 targets. He ran the fifth most routes for tight ends. He had the third most receptions and sixth most receiving yards with over 800. He had 8 touchdowns. So to me, a healthy Dalton Schultz is a top 5 to 7 fantasy tight end. So seeing that his snaps have increased, he's getting more targets, and he just had a good fantasy week, I feel like now we're getting more comfortable saying, hey, it's looking like he's healthy. Let's put him back in our rosters. Last one mentioned here, Tyler Higbee versus the Cardinals. So it'll be the last tight end mentioned because I talked about some streams earlier on the podcast, but Higbee has had solid weeks opening up the year. 14.1 fantasy points week 2, 17.3 week 4, 4 straight weeks above 10 fantasy points, weeks 2 through 5. The bye week hit, and then the last 2 weeks he scored under 4 fantasy points. So not great. Issue has been the targets. Weeks 1 through 5, he had 1 game under 9 targets and 3 games of 10 plus targets. So the volume was good. The last 2 weeks, he's only totaled 7 combined. The Cardinals are tied for the most points per game given up to tight ends on the year. So they obviously have been exploited by tight ends this season. There's a chance John Wolford, like I said before, is a starter. Maybe it's a safety route to go intermediate as far as his targets go to Tyler Higbee versus pushing the ball down the field. If Matt Stafford's back at a limited capacity, maybe that's the same thing. Maybe, these targets and throws to Tyler Higbee, in the middle of the field are easier against a team that has been, again, exploited by tight ends this season. So I feel like this is a good week to have some faith in Tyler Higbee bouncing back after back-to-back bad games. So I do like him in that matchup. So thank you guys for tuning in. Hopefully I spoke English for most of it. I know these solo pods sometimes I start going on rants and speaking fast, and it gets jumbled at times because it's one person talking for almost 40 minutes, 25 minutes, 30, whatever the case is, and not taking much of a breather. But hoping this podcast helped you guys out with some guys that you might have rostered, and maybe have given you a little bit more faith in placing some of these guys that I mentioned into your fantasy lineups. So if you're listening to this podcast or seeing it on Twitter, make sure to follow me at P2W Fantasy on Twitter. I'm dropping nonstop content on a daily basis in the form of threads and live streams and short videos, infographics, random tweets about player stats, things like that. I try to give people that consume my content a variety of ways of sharing information about fantasy football, and I grind this shit out. So appreciate you guys listening into the podcast here, and good luck in week 10 unless you're playing me.